Pablo, whenever you are ready.
I won't take more than a minute of your time, really, because I wanted to take this opportunity to greet you all. I was at the first session of Gonzalo's course. Then I've only been able to attend these next four ones in a recorded form, not directly, but I've seen them. And now finally, this one that is so central, as Juan de just said, well, to be able to be there in person again, just to tell you that, well, I think that the course is being of of I don't know if I should say of great height, but certainly of much intellectual stimulation, right? That is to say, it really opens very interesting horizons for us, right? And surely with all this, well, we will have to ask ourselves questions to reflect, right? And I also want to reiterate my gratitude to Gonzalo, right? For his generosity, for his lucidity, for his daring, right? Because he opens up very interesting horizons, right? And I take a lot of notes, and I have taken a lot of notes despite having already read the book, and many questions and also disagreements, as he also knows very well, but very stimulating, Gonzalo, truly, thank you. Because it's not common to find something like what you have done, right? Well, a system, a comprehensive explanation of the spiritual path. So thank you very much to you and to everyone for your participation, and onward, we keep moving forward.
Very well. Thank you very much, Pablo, once again for your words and because we dare to do this, right? So we'll see how everything ends in the end, won't we? But today we have to talk about a very central topic, perhaps the most important topic of the course, right? The first five sessions will trigger this topic in some way, and the last five also do, or rather, they will help us see how we can put it into practice, right? But let's see. We have started by changing the mental context, right? Among other things, because we already know, and I repeat that the mind usually does not accept what it does not understand, right? And therefore, well, all mystics, all the people with a very high level of consciousness, perhaps they do not need that exercise of understanding, as they intuitively know that everything that happens is the will of God. But until we become mystics, the best thing is for the mind to understand certain things so that it is not an obstacle, right, in our spiritual growth. We have, let's also say that this topic of accepting reality is a subject that has been clear in all religious traditions and all great spiritual masters of all traditions, right? For example, since we are in the West and we come from a Christian education and tradition, well, I would like to be able to identify, right, great saints or doctors of the church or even church fathers who have been clear on this topic and who have expressed it that way, right? What comes to mind is the letters or the visit made by Thomas More's daughter to Saint Thomas More when he was in prison 3 days before he was beheaded, right? And we remember that the daughter was very nervous and very anguished. And she asked her father how he was so calm, right? That if they were probably going to crucify him, I mean, decapitate him in 2 or 3 days, to which you already know the response of Thomas More, that it was this, right? He told his daughter, look, nothing can happen to me that God doesn't want. And what happens to me will be the best for my soul, right? We are talking about Saint Thomas More. For example, a Christian tradition, Saint Alphonsus Ligori, doctor of the church, in a very short book, about 85 pages, but small pages, huh? I believe you can freely find the PDF on the internet called Conformity with the Will of God. He says, never attribute to the devil or to men the misfortunes that happen to you. All good and bad things come from God, regardless of what instruments are used, right? If we combine that with what we also talked about on other occasions in previous sessions, right? Saint Basil of Caesarea, father and doctor of the church, who says that earth is a school of souls, right? If we add to that modern science, as we explained, and the understanding of the laws of the universe and how everything that happens by law, How many references are there in both the Old and New Testament to the necessity of fulfilling the law, right? And how much of Jesus's message was directed that way? How many times did he come to say, I come to fulfill the will of the Father, right? Who sent me, right? So I believe that even if we look at other traditions, in Buddhism, we already explained that according to Buddha, the secret of the cause of suffering lies in our selfish desire and in our non-acceptance of God's will because we want to have our own, no? He proposes the Eightfold Path, right? To get out of that lack of acceptance that you all know. As you see, this is a central theme of all the great, let's say, fathers or teachers of the different traditions. It's another thing that it might not be explained well from the pulpits today, but that doesn't change the fact, right, that the founders of the religions have been clear about it, right? In this sense, I would like to recommend a book to you. I always recommend a book in some of the sessions for those of you interested in delving deeper into this. In this case, the book you might like, besides that of Saint Alphonsus Liguori, is a book by a Christian monk, Don Vital Lehodei, called Holy Abandonment, right? In that book, you will see perfectly how all the saints, let's say Christians, have always affirmed the same thing, right? There is Saint Francis de Sales, Saint Bernard, Saint Alphonsus, all of them, right? That book explains very well, doesn't it, why everything that happens is the will of God, which he divides into direct will or permissive will, but says that both are equally the will of God, obviously, right? And therefore, nothing can happen that is not the will of God, right? Understanding this is very important because it is always easier for humans to accept the will of God than the will of other human beings, right? If we believe that they are the creators of reality, right? And therefore, this is, let's say, a fundamental idea. I must warn you that there is something in the book, The Holy Abandonment, that I like less. Since it was written quite some time ago, it still has a somewhat too anthropological view of God. And it might say things to you like God gets angry or God takes revenge or God punishes. Things we know aren't really true, right? About how everything is God's will. It is wonderful, and you will see, as all the great masters of the Christian tradition have affirmed. And that is why I recommend the book, right? Notice also that acceptance of reality is truly the quickest way to transcend the ego, right? Because in fact, we don't even have to fight against it directly, right? We simply must understand that everything that happens is the will of God, and that everything that happens is perfect and necessary for the development of souls. What we have to understand is that reality is not designed for the ego's comfort, nor even for its survival. That's why in the gospel, Jesus tells us, do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul, right? I mean, everything that happens is directed towards the growth and evolution of souls, isn't it? As we have seen, and as Saint Basil affirms, right? Once we understand that everything that happens is perfect for the evolution of our souls, it becomes much easier for us to accept reality, right? Of course, for that, we have to take our mind to the spiritual world, right? Because as we have said, not everything that happens is the best for the ego, right? There are accidents or diseases that can kill the ego, even the physical body, wars, disasters. But once again, repeat the gospel quote to make this clear. And disasters and wars and tribulations will come, but do not worry, they are necessary, right? And I wonder, necessary for what? Okay, if it is not for the evolution of the soul, right? And this is what we have to understand to begin trying to accept, right? So let's quickly see that accepting reality ends mental suffering, because mental suffering is nothing more than a mental resistance to what happens, right? It's important to distinguish this from physical pain, because clearly I can be accepting reality, but if someone hits my knee with a hammer, my knee will hurt no matter how much I accept reality, right? Now then, the question is if that knee pain, should it lead me to mental suffering or not, right? I know many people who have mental suffering without having any physical pain. And I know many people who have physical pain, but do not have mental suffering because they have accepted it as the most suitable thing, let's say, for their soul, right? So of course, with this word suffering, we have to be very precise and refer to the fact that in this talk, I will not be referring to physical pain, right? Instead, I will refer to mental suffering, okay? And how to heal it and how to eradicate it, right? Let's see, it's important not to have mental suffering because we gain nothing from mental suffering. I mean, the first consequence of mental suffering is that it lowers our vibration, right? And remember that we had talked in previous talks that our vital energy is the most important treasure we have, because the higher it is, the more we can understand, the more wisdom we can receive, right? Notice that one of the, I suppose, right, the motivations for meditating and contemplating is to seek that stillness, right? Which raises our vital energy so that we can receive more wisdom information, right? And therefore, mental suffering does not help us at all. I mean, if someone could explain to me how it helps us, mental suffering, well, I would be delighted to understand it, but I don't see any reason in which it helps us. That said, mental suffering, let's say, the only thing that helps us a bit is that it shows us our limitations, right? And provokes a change in thinking, right? A change makes us search, right? That's why I say that sometimes the spiritual path is reached more by saturation than by inspiration, right? In most cases, a person is tired of suffering, tired of having problems in life, and says, well, then I will look for other solutions, right? Okay. Let's say other things about acceptance. What is not acceptance? Acceptance is not immobility or passivity. It is true that everything that happens because it is God's will, and it happens through universal laws, but that should not lead us to immobility or passivity, because then we do not grow, right? We grow by giving the best of ourselves in every situation, as long as we know we must leave the results in God's hands, right? Because all our anguish and stress come from controlling results, not from giving our best, right? So when we give our best, then we observe the results. And if we have been under the law, the results will be good, desirable, and if not, they won't be. So we learn to follow the law by observing when we achieve good results in what we do, right? But if we don't give the best of ourselves, we are failing to give to Caesar what is Caesar's before giving to God what is God's, our inner peace, our acceptance, and our surrender, you see? Therefore, in Caesar's world, we have to learn to give our best. And therefore, we have to have our plans and we have to have our activity. Indeed, provisionally. Remember the saying, man proposes and God disposes, right? We must have our plans, but if we notice that they do not flow, that they do not go well, really, with all our best intentions at that moment, we might unknowingly go against the law, meaning we have to adjust our plans, right? After 2 or 3 attempts, where it's not due to a lack of perseverance, but not 7, as that would already be stubbornness, right? That's where we need to learn how the law works, and giving the best of ourselves and observing the results and accepting the results, right? All right, therefore, let it be clear that acceptance of reality is not passivity and is not immobility. Okay, let's see. Acceptance of reality is not approval of reality either. For example, I do not approve of the war in Ukraine. That doesn't mean I can't accept it, right? Those are 2 different things. If the war in Ukraine is happening, it's because it will serve as a spiritual lesson for many people. And that is why it happens according to God's will, right? But if it did not fit within God's will, the war in Ukraine would not be happening at all, right? But we have to understand that to accept something, we don't have to approve it, okay? There are many things that evidently happen in reality that are not aligned with the law of love. And everything that is not aligned with the law of love, well, we will not approve of it, right? But that doesn't mean we don't have to accept it, because above us is divine wisdom, which knows much better than we do what is best for the souls as a whole to achieve efficient spiritual growth. And as I said before, that is even explained in the gospel, right? But it is also explained in the gospel that even the last hair on our head is counted. That doesn't leave much room, right, for chance, right, in the universe or in creation, okay? Another very important thing we need to understand is that acceptance is not indifference either, okay? This is important to explain because this can sometimes cause some confusion. I believe that spiritual growth goes through 3 levels, right? When spiritual growth or the level of consciousness, as we saw in the 3rd session, is low, people are insensitive, okay? They don't care about the suffering of others. They only care about their own, achieve their goals. There's Putin with the war in Ukraine, or Pablo Escobar killing 300 people on a plane. Well, in other words, they do not care about the suffering of others or the tragedy caused by their actions. That is why we say that low levels of consciousness are insensitive. Medium and medium-high levels of consciousness are sensitive. Now, the suffering of others matters, and we suffer with others' suffering, right? Perhaps due to a misinterpretation of the culture, where it seems that if we do not suffer when loved ones or simply other beings suffer, then we are bad or insensitive. That is why sensitivity is already a step above insensitivity. But all spiritual traditions have recommended, whether for spiritual teachers or people of high levels of consciousness. Of course, when you enter that block of consciousness we once called mystics, they have recommended that we must move from sensitivity to what I call transsensitivity or metasensitivity. You see, in the Christian tradition, this has always been very clear and has been called holy indifference, okay? Of course, I don't like to call it holy indifference because holy indifference is not indifference at all, right? What it does have is a lot of understanding that everything that happens is the will of God, and that accepting the will of God frees us from mental suffering, right? Among other things, because if we do not free ourselves from mental suffering, we will harm our ability to serve because our vibration will decrease and we will not have the energy or mental clarity, right, that we need, nor the creativity to help other people with their problems or their lack of understanding. An example I usually give in some other conferences I've given on the subject is this, right? Imagine that Pablo and I are walking one night through the forest, calmly talking about spiritual topics and very happy. And I get distracted and fall into quicksand that I didn't see, okay? So what would I prefer? Pablo jumping into the quicksand with me to embrace me as we both drown, or staying outside so he can extend the branch and pull me out? We have to keep this in mind, right? Because if we want to be of service, we have to take care of our energy. We have to keep our creativity high, and therefore mental suffering is not going to help us with that, okay? Let's see, so far we have mentioned things that are not acceptance, right? Another thing that is not acceptance, right? It's resignation, okay? Resignation takes away our power. We find ourselves unable, right, to resolve those situations. And that's why we resign ourselves, right? But resignation, right, is a step above rebellion. But it is a step below acceptance, right? Resignation still consumes vital energy, right? Resignation, in some way, well, is a vague trust, right? That everything will be okay, that God is up there, but we don't like what's happening because it's contrary to our ego, right? and we find ourselves like with a lack of power or ability to resolve or to risk that situation, right? Therefore, acceptance is a spiritually much higher step than resignation, right? Which in turn is a step higher than rebelliousness, isn't it? Just like with insensitivity, sensitivity, and transsensitively. Therefore, those things are not acceptance. What acceptance is gratitude, right? If we are in acceptance, we have to be able to express gratitude to the universe, to God, to the consciousness, for those events that are created for our spiritual growth, precisely because they challenge us. And you always grow and learn more when something is challenging than when something simply doesn't affect you, right? Because when something costs you, right, in the ego, you have to face it. You have to understand it, and you have to change your attitude. Therefore, gratitude ends resignation, right? If any of us is resigned to something, we just have to understand the value it has, right? And understand that if we are grateful for it, right, then we will come out of that resignation, regain energy, and understand the why, right? Understanding the why of things, right? It always makes it much easier for us to accept them, okay? And we will see this in more detail later, all right? Acceptance also places us under the law, right? And by placing ourselves under the law, we'll immediately start observing the results, right? Hey, it's the only, right, attitude towards reality or life that doesn't consume our energy.
Oops, my phone, it's Siri. Well,
it is very important that we understand that when we talk about accepting reality, we are also talking about accepting our past. How many times do we look at the past with resignation or resentment or with guilt, right? Once again, we have to understand that everything that has happened to us in the past was necessary for our spiritual growth, or it wouldn't have happened, right? And that's why we have to clear it, right? Of course, we've all made, at least those of us who are of a certain age, countless mistakes in the past. That's what we came here for, to make mistakes and learn from them, right? Therefore, we cannot take away people's right that God gives them to make mistakes, to learn. But in the past, we cannot act. You see, it's a somewhat useless use of the mind unless it is used to look at the past with the sole purpose of learning from it. But everything else is a useless exercise and a waste of energy because we cannot act in the past. We cannot act in the future either. And most people sometimes spend half of our lives either going back to the past with whatever it is, guilt, resignation, sorrow, that kind of thing, or the future with anxiety, right? About what will happen or if such and such. But we don't focus on the present, which is where we can act, right? And where we can grow, right? So this is a very important topic, right? That acceptance is not only of the present reality, but also of past reality, right? And also of whatever future reality might come, isn't it? Do I make myself clear? It is a general and abstract acceptance, right? Notice that this is important, isn't it? And sometimes I also like to give an example that happened to me in life. You know, once I was eating with my eldest son, and my eldest son has 5 children, and he's a great guy, right? But one child misbehaved, and he punished him for 5 minutes in the corner. And when he came back, because of course I wasn't going to undermine my son in front of his children, right? When my eldest son came back, I said to him, hey, don't punish the child so much for things that might not be necessary. If you explain things to him and save the punishments for bigger issues, right? I remember my son said to me, he says to me, Dad, you were always a quite reasonable father, which we are grateful for. But if you had punished us a little more at 9 years old, nothing would have happened, my son tells me. And I replied to him saying, you little rascal. I tell him, when you were 9 years old and I made you stand in the corner, you would throw huge tantrums, right? Only now that you're 36 years old, right? And you're an adult, that's when you truly realize the value of those punishments, right? Well, I tell you the same. When we die, that is when the soul separates from the body. And many people who have gone through near-death experiences have already said this. The first thing we will be grateful for are precisely those difficulties, those problems, right, that helped us grow. And we will be less grateful for the phases of our life where we have been more comfortable, well, because that has helped us grow less. And since this is a school for souls, the more we grow in a course, the better. I don't know if I make myself clear, right? Now we do have to learn to grow while enjoying, not to grow by suffering, because suffering is the price we pay for growth. But if we learn to accept reality, we will start to grow without paying the price, right? And that will make growth more efficient, because I insist there will be less energy spent, right, along the way. Well, therefore, when we do not accept reality, it is because we want to fit reality to our egoic preferences without understanding the function of reality, which I insist is to achieve the most efficient growth of souls, right? Let's remember once again, because this was for me a thought, an idea, a vision, right? Very important, that helped me a lot in my spiritual path, which is that famous triangle, right? Which I repeat, right? Where here we place this vertex spiritual understanding, here we place inner peace, and here we place vital energy, right? So if we spiritually understand reality, we will have more inner peace, our energy will rise, we will be able to understand more, we will have more peace, it will rise again. It can be pointing up or down, right? We don't understand, we lose peace, our vital energy decreases, we understand even less. So it's very important that this triangle is pointing upwards in our lives, isn't it? Through our spiritual understanding, which is what leads us to accept reality, right? Let's see, another important thing, right, to explain with this acceptance is that we cannot think of this, right? Let's see, when I was a young man and hadn't understood much about spirituality, I understand now. I was willing to accept the will of God, of course, right? The thing is, I would say, I don't know what it is because he doesn't call me to tell me. Well, I didn't know what to accept. And then I had this dualistic thought that evil could never be within God's will. Because if God was love, right, how could he allow evil? And so evil was created by men, and that I did not accept. And I accepted the will of God, which I did not know what it was. The result of that thought is that there was no acceptance in me, right? Because I did not accept reality for those two reasons, because I thought not everything was created by God in some way, only the good, right? And the second is that he didn't call me on the phone to tell me what it was, I was waiting to see what the will of God was to accept it. What we have to understand is that we see God's will in operation every day. Because as I have also said in other talks, the solution between intelligent design and evolution, there is only one solution, which is to go above the two, right? And reach continued creation or emergence, isn't it? That is, Genesis is right that God is the creator, but where Genesis is wrong, in my humble opinion, is when it says that on the sixth day he rested, right? Because God has not rested, God has not disengaged from creation. In fact, if consciousness is what continuously collapses the electron's wave function, allowing reality to exist, then it means that process is ongoing, otherwise nothing would happen, at least in the world of form, let's say. Therefore, I think we have to understand that, right? Mental suffering can only stem from two causes. Either a lack of spiritual understanding or a lack of acceptance, right? Of course, without spiritual understanding, there is no acceptance. And without acceptance, the suffering doesn't stop. Therefore, we need to realize when we are suffering from something that's not pleasant for the ego in life, right? We need to look for the root in one of those two things. What we are not understanding spiritually, right? Or what we are not accepting. It's true that acceptance requires training, right? Because of course the process is this, isn't it? The process is, I have deeply understood that I need to accept reality for all these reasons. But now I go back home and this happens to me, and I start to suffer again, right? Therefore, all wisdom, right? I don't care. In any area where human beings are trying to learn, it requires training, doesn't it? And if we want to learn to play the piano, if we don't exercise our fingers, or if we want to learn to play golf, if we don't hit balls, then no matter how much we know the theory, right, we won't be able to implement it in our lives. Therefore, in this matter of acceptance, I would like to suggest an exercise that is very short, but gave me very good results, right? We are not all the same. Maybe it won't yield the same result for everyone, but it worked for me, and that's why I recommend it, right? Every night before going to bed, I tried to identify what had taken away my peace that day. One day it was maybe, well, I don't know, that my son had been expelled from school because he had done something mischievous, or that I had lost money in an investment, or that the doctor had told me that I had an illness or whatever, or that, I don't know, a friend, a loved one, my partner, whoever, had a stressful day and had insulted me or confronted me or whatever. So I identified everything that took away my peace during that day I had lived, right? Or that I got a flat tire on a rainy day when I was running late for a meeting, you know? What has taken away my peace? Or the plane that got canceled. So what has taken away my peace? And then I would, after identifying what had taken away my peace that day, I would ask myself a second question, which is, how does my mind need to see this, the same situation that took away my peace differently, right? So that it no longer takes away my peace. And after doing that exercise for 15 days, I was able to identify that there were hundreds of things that took away my peace. And that, but unlike medicine, right, where if you have an illness, they prescribe you one medication, and if you have a different illness, they prescribe you another. I realized that with this acceptance thing, it was just aspirin for everything. I mean, it didn't matter what had taken my peace. There was only one way to think about those different situations that restored my peace, right? And it is this way of thinking that I have told you. I conveyed in the first part of this talk, right? Look, if my tire got punctured, it's because it was necessary for my spiritual growth, whether I understand it or not, right? God does not make mistakes. Wisdom is efficient. And God does not create events or situations where the event or energy is wasted because it doesn't have a pedagogical value. And proof that I needed that pedagogical lesson is that when it happened, it took away my peace, okay? So everything in your life that takes away your peace is indicating that you need it for your spiritual growth. You see? All this is important to understand, isn't it? Mental suffering, if you look closely, is like it's like a fever, right? The fever tells us that we have an infection in the body, right? And the white blood cells are bam, they shoot up and such, and the body temperature rises because we are fighting against that infection. Well, the suffering is the infection of the mind, right? Mental suffering must be indicating that we have an illness in the mind, that there is a lack of understanding. That leads us to the situation, just like fever is an indication that we have, right? An illness in the body, right? So notice that if we understand this, suffering only has, in essence, two functions. One is to prevent our evolution from stopping in some way, and the other is to measure our level of ignorance, right? And therefore, once we understand that, well, when we suffer from something, a light bulb immediately goes on saying, wait, what am I not understanding? What am I not accepting? What am I? It moves away from the will of God, right? Because perfect acceptance, as we have said, completely frees from suffering, doesn't it? And therefore, we must understand that we do not have to confront reality, right? We must confront our own mind, our ego, and our ignorance, not reality. Notice that once again, because of course the gospel is fabulous, once again, this is explicitly taught in the gospel when Jesus tells us that we should work on finding the inner kingdom and that everything else will be given to us in addition, okay? Or by law, right? So for me, divine provision is the law. It took me many years to understand this. And I remember that I was the terror of the priests, because I would say to them, hey, yes, I understand this concept of divine provision, but tell me how it works. And everyone would say to me, well, it's a mystery, you have to believe it by faith. And I would say, damn, I can't manage my business with mysteries, I have to manage my businesses or my life with things that I understand, right? Therefore, we have to understand how divine provision works, right? But of course, the teaching of Jesus cannot be false. Therefore, it must be better understood to be used, right? But it is, in my opinion, a relationship, right, that we can make between the laws and this evangelical teaching, right? Moreover, acceptance will free us, right, from the terrible habit, the bad habit of reproach, right? Because it's that when we are accepting reality, there's nothing to reproach, okay? And when we reproach, right, what we're doing is using our ego to tell another person that we are right and they are not, okay? So reproach is not service. Reproach never helps to approach the other. I don't know if I'm explaining myself, right? And somehow, well, share, right? Your good energy, right? The reproach is more of an ego-driven struggle or imposition, where we want to come out on top because we are right and the other is not, right? Another thing that you will that we have to gradually start doing with this topic of acceptance is that we quickly understand that acceptance in some way is a loss of personal agenda, right? To replace our own agenda with God's agenda, right? I remember once more when I was a young entrepreneur, aggressive and focused and such, every 1st of January, I would make my list, of things I wanted to improve or achieve that year, whatever they were, right? Let's see if I have a bigger house, or I don't know, right? Or a better car, or for my company to grow, or to see if I can regain my health if I've lost it. Anyway, I had a list of resolutions, right, for that year, Gosh, what anguish and stress trying to achieve them, right? Somehow, right? Whereas now on January 1st, I only have one resolution. This is the truth. I mean, just one, right? That God's will be done. That's it. It's notice that in the prayer that Jesus Christ directly taught us, right? The one he somehow invented and transmitted to us, the Our Father, right? Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, right? I mean, perhaps because it was the prayer suggested by Christ, we have to pay special attention to it, right? And the theme of accepting the will of God is a central theme of that prayer, as you know, right? Fine. Notice also that acceptance frees us from fears, and that the opposite of love is fear. And there are 4 central types of fears from which all other sub-fears derive. The ego is the specialist of fear and is the locus of fear. Notice that we have the fear of death, of non-existence, right? Fear of losing something or someone we believe is necessary for our happiness. Fear of facing people or situations, or fear of abandonment. Notice that Jesus on the cross, when his energy was already depleting and he was about to pass away, experienced that fear of abandonment. You see? Lord, Lord, why have you forsaken me? Of course, that in Jesus is normal, meaning it's impossible because he was one with the Father, right? But when our energy lowers in whatever way, either because we are about to die, or we are sick or exhausted, it is when those fears resurface easily. And that is why we even see it in Jesus, that it is impossible for Jesus to have uttered those words if he hadn't been hanging on the cross and experiencing that suffering, a drop in physical energy, because he was a perfect man, right? And so all human issues in the body affected him, as is logical, or he wouldn't have been a perfect man. So look, think about how accepting reality will free us from all fears. And if we are freed from fear, love flourishes, right? Because fear is the opposite to love, not hate, Hate is the opposite of affection, right? So therefore, that saying from love to hate is just a step is not true. It's from affection to hate that there's just one step. From love to hate, there is no possible step, right? So see how acceptance will free us from fears, right? And therefore, as our need for growth creates our reality, right? That's also why the spiritual saying goes, what we resist persists. Because when we do not accept something, we do not learn what it comes to teach us. And therefore, that same event or situation keeps repeating itself, even with slight variations throughout our lives until we finally learn what it is trying to teach us. It comes to teach us spiritually, right? Therefore, one of the best ways to facilitate, acceptance is, and it is that we start little by little to prefer our spiritual growth over our egoic desires or our comfort. Okay? The ego wants comfort. It wants security. It wants control. We saw this in the second session, right? It wants to be accepted, loved, and admired by everyone. That's what the ego wants. But if we want to transcend the ego, we will have to go through situations that threaten the security or control of the external or the acceptance that others have of us, right? Because we have to transcend the ego. And if we do not go through those situations, we will not end up transcending it. That's why we have to be grateful and prioritize our spiritual growth, which is what we came here for, right? Over our success, comfort, or anything else in life, okay? And that change of preference will help us a lot with the issue of acceptance, okay? Before finishing, also mention 2 or 3 things that I believe are important regarding the of acceptance, right? First, let's not seek more difficulties in life than what life brings us, because that, once again, is the ego in control of our growth. Look, since God doesn't send me enough difficulties, I'm going to create them myself, right? And that way I increase my spiritual growth. Let's see, the surrender to God's will. It does not advise us to do that. Whatever has to happen to us, God will put it in our path. Therefore, do not go looking for trouble. Annoyances, sacrifices, problems that the law or life aren't putting before you, because that would be masochism, not surrendering to the will of God. We are here to grow while enjoying, and do not worry about all the experiences we have to have in order to grow. We will have them, or we will have had them, right? Or we will have them in the future, but do not seek them yourselves. If God does not cause you many difficulties, then fantastic. Keep enjoying life. Keep learning from what comes. And maybe it's because you have already learned enough and you don't have to go through more dramatic things for that learning to happen, right? All right. Notice, second to last, that acceptance of reality is far more effective than psychoanalysis, right? When people have problems in life, we go to a psychologist or do psychoanalysis, right? And let's see, psychoanalysis is useful and it helps us, of course, but it is long and costly, right? And we go back to the past and the traumas to try to cleanse them. And in that process, we somehow re-energize them, don't we? But also psychoanalysis is not aimed at the transcendence of the ego, but at the perfection of the ego, to achieve an ego that is acceptable to the psychotherapist or to the culture of society, right? Thus, it is slower and also remains at the mental level, right? All classical psychology remains at the mental level, doesn't it? We are proposing spiritual psychology, right? Which integrates spiritual understanding in the treatment of trauma, correct? Because traumas are nothing more than situations that have happened to us that at the time our emotional and sentimental body was not prepared to handle in some way and created a trauma for us, right? But of course, the best way to clear that trauma is not years of psychoanalysis, but rather understanding why it happened. In other words, when we understand why things that left us traumatized happened in some way, and that the reason was the need for spiritual growth, we heal very quickly. We can see even the most traumatic things from our past as something we can be grateful for because they were necessary for our growth. And once we use that spiritual understanding, it becomes practically useless. A psychoanalysis or other therapies, let's say, psychological at a mental level, right? Because we have much more strength from spiritual understanding and from the soul, right? To solve past problems or traumas than from the mental analysis of them, right? And that is something I would also like to explain, right? We should always create a new meaning, right? For the things that happen. It's much easier to heal traumas, right? Like I was saying before about the past. I look at my past and say, how many mistakes I've made. With what I know now, I wouldn't have done that. Well, of course not. But if I hadn't done that, I might not be where I am now, you know? And therefore, we have to make peace with our past and accept our future before it happens, right? Because that way, whatever happens, it won't take away our peace. And lastly, because I think I've already used up the time between the questions, it's understanding that acceptance is a complement to wisdom, right? That is, wisdom leads us to understand the order of the universe, doesn't it? But acceptance is what allows us to continue. So if we combine wisdom with acceptance, well, we rocket forward in our spiritual work, right? Which is ultimately what we all want, because the more we delay the spiritual growth, the more we perpetuate suffering, right? As we have seen before, that is the price we pay for growth, okay? So I suppose that with this topic of acceptance, we might have some things left, right? Left in the, let's say, in the pipeline. But well, I think we have been able to offer some ideas on acceptance that I hope will help us all, right? And with this, well, I conclude the presentation and open myself to any questions that there may be on this topic.
All right, thank you, Gonzalo. Thank you very much for your presentation today. We're going to read some questions we have here that have been written here in the chat. Mario asks if mental suffering isn't a reality too.
Yes, of course it is. But a reality we want to be freed from, right? Because there are many ways to define happiness, I suppose, right? But one way to define happiness is undoubtedly the absence of suffering, right? Well, of course, suffering is a reality. We see it every day. Moreover, we have all experienced it. Those of us who are of a certain age, right? Yes, it is a reality. What we are trying is see what is the most efficient or fastest or most powerful way, right? To free ourselves from that mental suffering that bothers us all, right? I don't think anyone wakes up in the morning saying, I'm going to suffer today, right? I think people want to be happy. People want to unite with God. People want to grow spiritually. And we suffer because we don't know how to manage ourselves, or because we don't understand spiritual reality completely. Or sometimes we don't understand why things happen. And that's what makes us suffer. I have said, I think already in this course, on another occasion, that when I was a child, when I was a boy, well, of course, I preferred to be on summer vacation than being at school, right? But one of the things that comforted me when I went to school was knowing that it would serve a purpose, right? That it had future benefits, right? And that eased my suffering from having to leave the beach to go into the classroom, right? So understanding why what happened to us is meaningful will also help ease mental suffering in everyday life.
Thank you, Gonzalo. Let's move on to another question. Here are some questions. Similar, I'll try to summarize it. how can we discern between God's will and what my mind thinks should be done?
Let's see. The will of God is reality. So when you observe a reality, that is the will of God. Now in Miami, yesterday it was sunny, today it is cloudy. There's an iguana in the garden, and I'm sitting in this room giving this lecture and chatting with you, and that's reality. That's the will of God, right? We can see what the will of God is by observing reality, okay? That is the way to see the will of God. Sometimes we might not understand why the will of God moves in one direction or another, but that is our problem, not a problem of God, right? We can understand better or worse what and why the will of God is. But by observing reality, we know it's the will of God. It's what I said at the beginning of the talk, which is important. Because, of course, if I don't believe that all religion is the will of God, then I'll only accept what seems acceptable to me, right? So it is my ego that is in control of the situation. I accept what I want or what I think I have to accept, right? The way to transcend the ego is that I accept the will of God, right? Whatever mine may be, or whatever my previous thought about it may be, or whatever, right? And that is how the ego is transcended, because otherwise it is the ego that controls my acceptance, and the acceptance is selective. I accept this, maybe not that. It's like forgiveness. So we have a selective forgiveness, which is I still see that this person did something dirty to me, right? But I decide not to take revenge, and I can choose not to retaliate sometimes and other times not. It depends, right? That the deep forgiveness, and we will see this in more detail in the next session on self-responsibility, is to understand that. So I am the cause of what happens to me, not the person who carries it out. They are merely an instrument that God uses as part of his will to bring me an experience that can help me grow spiritually. And so I no longer get angry with the instrument. At most, I get angry with God, right? But of course, getting angry with God is like if my son, my 9-year-old son, gets angry with me when I lovingly punish him because he has done something mischievous, right? That no longer happens once the child grows up, as we saw in the previous example, right? Therefore, that would be my answer to the question.
Mental suffering, Gonzalo, goes against universal laws.
Yes, let's see. It is allowed by law because it shows us our limitations, but the only way that we do suffer is because it's in some way that we are going against the law, right? Of course, if we are always aligned with the law of love, suffering is impossible, right? I can't imagine God suffering. I believe you can't either, right? Therefore, well, of course, in some way, suffering is allowed by the law, but suffering at its core is violating the law of harmony, okay? You remember the second law we explained the other day, right? When we are suffering, we are violating the law of harmony without realizing it. But violating the law of harmony is allowed by the law of evolution, because if we don't make mistakes, we don't learn the law, okay? Therefore, suffering is indeed going against the law, but it is permitted within the laws to happen. Otherwise, it would not occur. Nothing that is not permitted by the law happens in the universe, or the universe would fall into disorder.
Thank you, Gonzalo. Esther says, thank you very much, Gonzalo, for everything you tell us. And asks for you. Sorry, does the devil not exist for you?
Okay, let's see. One moment. Sorry for the interruption. Let's see. About the devil, there are two different conceptions in the world of spirituality. Okay? The Christian conception of the devil is that he is a fallen angel, as we all know, who rebels out of pride against God. And then somehow he goes on to hinder or obstruct, right, the union of human beings with God. Well, that's one way to look at it. There's another way seen by other spiritual traditions, which is the following. It says, man, there are 3 archangels who deal with the management of the universe at the highest level, right? San Miguel, San Gabriel, and Lucifer, right? And then Lucifer means the one who brings the light. I mean, therefore, Lucifer is the master teacher, just as Michael takes care of creation and Gabriel of the, let's say, in the universe, there are three central functions, right? Creation, the administration of creation, and the guidance of God's children. So Lucifer is seen as the one who brings the light, and that's why he's called Lucifer. And therefore, he is not an evil being, but rather the one responsible for placing challenges in our lives. Exactly, so that we can grow. Well, whatever the two views people have about the demon, let's get into the first one, the Christian one, right? The proud angel, how about that? Okay, so what I'm going to say now, I hope it's understood well, right? Because I don't want it to be misunderstood. And if it's misunderstood, you let me know and we'll keep answering the question, right? But even if the demon is that evil angel that has rebelled, I don't know how, because angels don't have egos and I don't know how they could rebel, but maybe something escapes my mind, and it's possible for an angel to rebel, right? Imagine that we accept that conception of the demon. The question then is, how do we neutralize it, right? So how do we neutralize the demon's influence in our lives, right? Then I would say that the best way to do it is returning to the law of love, right? Which is the primordial law of the universe. So I ask two questions. Has God created the demon, yes or no? The answer to that question is yes, okay? Because God has created everything, the devil too. Second question, does God love all that is created? The answer is yes, because God is love and therefore loves everything he has created. If God stopped loving something, we couldn't say that God is love. We would have to say that God is love, except for the demon, okay? Good. Therefore, I must unite with God and love everything that God loves. Therefore, I neutralize the demon when I love it. I insist, loving does not mean approving. Loving does not mean living with someone who is not at your level or who has impurity or ill intent. Love is not foolish, right? And we must be prudent, okay? But do not fear it, because then fear goes against love. The demon does not, as St. Thomas More would say, the demon cannot do anything to us that God does not want. The demon is also subject to the will of God. It is just another instrument. What difference does it make whether a human criminal does something to me or the demon does it? What difference does it make? It is an instrument, right? In the hands of God to make something happen to me that I need for my growth. Therefore, before the demon, whatever your conception, if we have the Christian conception, what we need is to be prudent, but not fearful. That difference between prudence and fear is very small and very subtle, right? So you have to know how to place yourself within it. For example, what does it mean to love the demon? Well, it means wishing him the best. Hopefully, one day he redeems himself or changes his attitude and joins God. And if I could help him with that, then I would, but I can't, shouldn't, and am not in a position to do it. Because he is a fallen angel and I am still a human being, I remain prudent regarding the devil. So please, let's not engage in the foolishness of things people do, like Ouija boards and other superstitions. No, that is imprudent, right? So maybe by not giving Caesar what is Caesar's, well, God allows the devil to do something to us, right? But once we are prudent, my advice is not to fear. Remove the word devil from your minds. It is nothing more than an instrument in the hands of God, like all the others, to bring about something we need to experience if it must happen. Am I making myself clear? Therefore, for me, the devil is a topic that doesn't even exist in my mind. I mean, in the good sense of the word, right? I mean, in the case that we follow the Christian conception of what the devil is, in the case we follow the other conception, then there is no problem at all, because the devil is simply doing what it has to do, right? So that the rest of us grow by following God's orders. But don't worry, because God controls the devil. It is not otherwise. And therefore, let the devil do what it wants. You know what I'm going to tell you? It cannot do anything that God does not want. What is not foreseen. Because keep in mind that I have always said that eternity is not a very long time, but rather it is outside of time. Therefore, if there is no sequence, There is no surprise. And therefore, I assure you that there is nothing the demon can do that surprises God, including its rebellion.
Thank you, Gonzalo, for this beautiful answer to this question. So complex, right? So complicated. Another question from Gabby. It says, Gonzalo, what is the relationship between individual prayer requests and the will of God?
Let's see. All individual will, as we have explained, is by nature self-centered, okay? That is why it is called individual will. It is ego-driven, right? Our will ceases to be ego-driven when we no longer hold on to it in the best sense of the word, but instead we desire for whatever God wills to happen. Therefore, I think it's a bit, maybe I'm wrong, huh? But I always answer your questions sincerely, and my answers won't be free of error, huh? But let's see. Asking for a red Ferrari is not an appropriate prayer, because we will have that according to divine law, or we will not have it, depending on whether it is necessary or not for our spiritual growth. Sometimes it is necessary to finally have that red Ferrari once and for all, just to realize that it doesn't bring happiness, and that because after 2 months, the leather no longer smells new and you've grown tired of the Ferrari. You no longer take it for a spin just for the joy of it. You use it simply as transportation like any other car, right? So asking for a red Ferrari is not, in my opinion, the right prayer, because God already knows what our ego-driven desires are and will only give us what we need to grow, which can include a red Ferrari in some cases and situations, and in others not. I believe the prayer should be a prayer of union with God, right? A request for union, a request for wisdom, right? But not a request for things or results, right? For example, listen, if I want to be cured of this illness, or for someone to be cured of this illness, I think the best prayer is, please help them accept this illness. Then whether it is cured or not will depend on many things. On the law for him, you understand? On what he and others around him have to learn, on whether it is within the law to be cured or not. But I believe that any prayer of acceptance, right, that helps us embrace acceptance, to put ourselves at his service, to desire union with him, that is always useful. But prayers asking for things or specific outcomes, I believe, are less useful.
Gonzalo, there's a question from
Yes, there's the watch. Sorry, these Apple Watches? No. Siri, Alexa, whatever, activates on its own without you touching anything.
There is a question from someone in Mexico asking how they could get your books there.
Well, the best is through Amazon. Amazon, on Amazon, you can find them. If there's any difficulty in getting it from Amazon, I would be delighted to send you the electronic PDF. Sending a physical book to Mexico or another place is a hassle, because they get lost in customs, they never arrive. I've had experiences, right? So I think the best is to buy it on Amazon, where they should deliver it in Mexico as well. Or if for whatever reason, it's not possible to get it through Amazon in Mexico, which surprises me because I believe other people in Mexico have managed, I would be happy if you send me an email and I'll send the PDF, right? The electronic one, I think it's the best solution.
There is a question from Rafael from Seville, who says that he believes that all of this about acceptance is very well understood by Muslim mystics.
Yes, of course. All mystics understand it very well, or they are not mystics. I mean, look, inner peace and acceptance are the gateway to mystical consciousness. Without that, there is nothing to be done. I believe, right?
Without that, there's nothing to do.
Yes, because you remain in the ego. And without it, you remain in the ego. And if you stay in the ego, it creates interference, right? that constant emotional, mental, and sentimental conflict lowers the human being's vibration, right? And then it doesn't allow us, it acts like an umbrella, like a canopy, blocking us from grace, right? Therefore, I think that is necessary if one aspires. It's true that this topic, the mystics, the Muslims, the Sufis in particular, have perhaps treated it with special wisdom, right? But I believe that with whichever mystics you read from any tradition, and I have spent 4,000 hours doing that, this is a common theme among all of them, as we explained at the beginning of the conference, right? In my opinion, you won't find any mystic who does not intuit or understand that everything is God's will and must be accepted, right? Perhaps we will see that clearly with all these Christian mystics in the book, The Holy Abandonment, as it explains, right? But yes, I believe Muslims have understood it well. I agree with the person asking the question.
Very well, Gonzalo. See, perhaps one last question to finish. One says, it seems that the acceptance, spiritual growth is a matter of age. How can it be accelerated? How can young people learn to accept?
That he said, belief is a matter of giving. He says,
that
of
is
giving, truly.
of age, of years.
Well, look, there's some truth to it. The other day I was talking about acceptance with a very wise person who holds a high position, right, in one of the important religions in the world. And talking about acceptance, he was telling me that, yes, I was very right in everything I was saying, but there are things in life that require gray hair. And well, yes, I think, let's see, any young person can understand acceptance, right? Just as those of us who are no longer young can understand it. But of course, it requires a bit of training, doesn't it? And that takes its time, right? And it's maturity, right? But because, of course, when you are young, you are still very volcanic, right? So the whole emotional, sentimental, and mental body, well, was very active, right? And besides, young people, as you see on television, always have everything clear, right? And they know more than anyone. That is a part of the ignorance of growing up, right? So yes, I think acceptance can be understood by young people, and by older people, I mean understood. But as we said before, acceptance also has to be trained, right? To be able to apply it in our lives. And that takes time, doesn't it? Because the ego resists giving up control. I mean, the ego, before it dies or is neutralized. It is very annoying, right? And well, young people have to learn all that. But well, it's true that it also depends on the level of consciousness, right? Of course, I remember when I talked with Mother Teresa, how she told me that she understood these things since she was a child, right? Of course, the soul can to be born already at the fourth level, right? And therefore, from that point on, you don't have to explain much to that person, no matter how young they are, right? But for more normal beings, we have had to learn it with, let's say, with time, with gray hair, and with experience, of course. Both things are true, ultimately.
Thank you, Gonzalo, for this lovely talk again. I will pass the word to Pablo in case he wants to say something. 1 second. Here it goes. Pablo, yes, perfect. Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Yes. Well, then, thank you very much, Gonzalo, for this masterclass. I took a lot of notes. I was thinking that with you, it's like with St. Thomas, that once you enter, you do not leave. Well, it is a systematic thought that accepts the starting points. No? So everything is already connected. Everything. I mean, it's a system ultimately. But well, yes, we have to keep talking, and I thank you from the heart. No, yes, so many things, right? Very juicy, very. I don't know. It's always surprising. I mean, to find a person who is so well situated, so organized, right? Thank you from the bottom of my heart, and also thanks to the 134 of us who are now connected here, because it surely gives us something to think about, to meditate on, and ultimately to live by, right? A big hug to everyone. Thank you all.
Until next Thursday.
See you next Thursday, Gonzalo.